everyone to our Coaching Pathways to Success interview series, which is proudly brought to you by the ICF Australasia Southern States branch. This series brings to life diverse stories from our members about how they're making a living out of coaching. My name is Rebecca Cattran. I'm president of the ICF Southern States branch, and I'm thrilled to welcome Janet Sernack to our conversation today to share with our members her coaching journey. Janet is the founder and CEO of Imagination, a global learning and coaching company that unlocks human potential and develops human skills that enable people to adapt, innovate, and grow through disruption. She has over 30 years' experience consulting and leading culture development, change management, leadership, and innovation education and coaching to some of Australia's, Canada's, and Israel's top 100 companies. She's acknowledged as a global thought leader on the people side of innovation. She's an ICF PCC coach and a professionally certified coach for innovators, MBIT, and NLP. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, she has significant coaching experience. So thank you so much for joining us today, Janet.
And thank you for having me, Rebecca. I'm quite humbled to be one of the people chosen to be in this very exciting and valuable series.
You're very welcome, Janet, and appreciate your support. So let's get started. I love hearing about people's career journeys and stories. So tell me, how did you get started with Imagination?
Oh, that's a really great question. I started actually in business management consulting, like probably a lot of other coaches, and then moved into marketing management and realized that the best laid business plans ended up in the bottom drawer because people didn't know how to catalyze, enact, and embed positive change. So I moved into the learning and development space and ultimately became a coach as an add-on service initially to clients until I relocated to the Middle East, which was a totally different culture. They used to say, you know, it's like living on an estuary on the edge of chaos, which is very relevant for how we're living today in such a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environment. And I wanted to be part of a community, and ICF was global, and saw coaching as an emerging field. And that was when I became credentialed and also created a startup, which is called Imagination, which was a division to Compass Learning, which was my original learning and development company. So I did it through necessity. I also needed to earn a living because I couldn't speak the language. So I needed to work globally. And fortunately, it was just when LinkedIn and the internet was becoming really proactive. So before I knew it, I was building a brand. I was blogging and networking and went into the not knowing space and exploration and navigation, and learned a lot from making some very big and costly mistakes. And then just really started to specialize on the people side of innovation because I used to go to the global conferences and the European process engineers would say, it's all about the process. And I would say, no, it's all about the people. So
I love that. And it really came through for me really strongly reading your bio ahead of today, Janet, about the focus on people and humans, because that's what makes the world turn round, right? And I love how you mentioned earlier about your path and your meandering to Imagination. And it just made me think about how necessity is the mother of invention, right? And how coaching was part of what you did and has increasingly become more front and center for you. So thinking about your background that you brought to the table as a coach, how do you feel that really helped set you up for success on your coaching path?
I'm a bit of a learnaholic, and I also love change, even though at times it can be quite painful. So I think having that open mind, being always open-hearted and being open-willed, which means a lot about not trying to control the outcome.
Mm.
So I didn't know what I didn't know in learning terms. Of course, we call that unconscious incompetence. And it was only through experimenting and taking small bets one step at a time that I
Mm.
started to build a whole learning curriculum as well as a coaching methodology. So I think being okay with not knowing,
Yes.
being uncomfortable, allowing yourself to be really uncomfortable, and of course moving into your growth and learning zone
Mm.
and taking risks. I think everybody said you can't teach the you can't coach people, how to be adaptive and innovative because you weren't born here, or you can't do this.
Ah.
So it was working within all of those constraints and and always staying focused on the possibility
Mm.
of what I could do. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. I think that mindset is so important, isn't it? As coaches and working in the space of change, to really have that sense of optimism, and also, I would say, pragmatism around exactly as you described, what is possible, rather than we don't want to be overwhelmed by barriers. So interesting, and what we've heard a little bit already, Janet, and also again comes through in your bio, is very much that sense of a global presence as far as working in different countries and different cultures. So tell me a little bit more about that global positioning that you're very deliberately taking now.
So we live in Australia, and Australia is actually very conventional. And I've only been in Melbourne now for 7 years. So I'm originally from Sydney. And
Mm-hmm.
then we're in the Middle East for 6 years, and now 7 years in Melbourne. Because most of you are in the southern states, and you know that we tend to be a little bit more conservative and conventional in this part of Australia, even though we're very economically successful. I realized that there was not yet, and there still isn't yet, a big appetite for innovation. People think that innovation is just continuous improvement. Uh,
Mm.
they think that it's all about products and services. So, because I'd always worked in the area of mindset and behavior, I knew that innovation was based very much on not only your mindset, but the emotional states behind that. And in terms of behaviors, you need to develop very habitual, specific behaviors, and you need very specific sorts of skills that really aren't being taught in the business schools or the universities, because we have a lot of professors and writers do our Coach for
Mm.
Innovators program. So I realized pretty quickly that my audience was global, very much people, if you think about the product life cycle or the life cycle curve, the innovators and the early adopters
Mm.
who knew that we would need to be creative and inventive and innovative and know the differences between those and how to be, think, and act differently. So,
Yes.
as I said, I didn't know what I didn't know, but I did in end up developing a global brand just through staying very consistent with my message in my blogs. And I met
Mm.
the most amazingly collaborative people online through LinkedIn and other areas. And I look back at my first blogs with horror because they really weren't that well written. But 10 years on, I love being in that space, and it is very much at the forefront of a global perspective on the people side of innovation.
Mm. Beautiful. No, thank you for sharing that. And it sounds like it was almost like that appetite, your own appetite for exploration and thinking bigger, as well as your experience living in different countries and with different cultures, that has really continued to fuel this global focus for you.
Yeah, and they're calling it now, oh, there's a new word for it. Not so much foresight, but your ability to
Mm.
see what's coming in the future. And
Yes.
having had a background in the fashion industry in retail, that was my job initially.
Mm.
So how can you not so much predict what's happening, but
Yeah.
how can you anticipate?
Yes.
And what I started to see 10 years ago is happening today. So you're always looking to see the trends and the patterns and to know how to make
Exactly.
the connections, which is your cognitive ability. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So that ability to plan and be responsive has served you well in that way. And I love the fact you brought, pardon the pun, the thread of your background in fashion into this, because I think it's really interesting to see how our former careers help support our current careers and future direction. So a little bit of this has been coming through already, Janet, but I'd love to hear more about, on your journey of 30 plus years in business to date, what have been some of the key lessons that you've learned along the way that would be of value for our listeners to hear more about?
Okay, and another good question. Thank you. So that's the thing about coaching. It's the art of really good questioning and awesome listening. So I come from an entrepreneurial background as well. So whether you're a mum and dad corner business or a startup entrepreneur or someone just starting a new business, it's basically a roller coaster ride. There are going to be peaks and troughs. You think in one model they talk about the valley of despair. So in other models,
Such visual language.
but then you have this exponential growth. So what I found when I interviewed startup entrepreneurs when I was doing my research is that, and one guy said, I did a master's in entrepreneurship at the main university in the city that I live in. Then I went to the Wharton Business School and got my MBA, but no one prepared me for the roller coaster ride that I would be going on. And when we talk
Right,
about the roller coaster ride, it's emotional, but it's also visceral.
right.
So I think, the word resilience, as much as it's overused, it is just so important if you combine it with grit, which is
Mm,
determination and persistence. The agility, when, is to make an intentional shift in a changing context. It's just constant tweaks. They might be little tweaks or they might be big tweaks, in the language that we call
mm.
it today is you iterate and you pivot, and to be
Yes.
constantly prepared to do that. The other thing that's really important is to always be open, and we use the emergence model from Dr. Otto Scharmer, from
Mm-hmm.
Theory U or Presencing, which is open mind, open heart, and open will. So always pay attention. And I think we're in, and our clients are really suffering from a war on their attention right now.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be really attentional and intentional, always focus on your purpose, your outcome, your meaningful work, and the work that really matters. And then the other thing I learned, especially when I hit the valley of despair, is self-care and self-compassion. Uh,
Mm.
so it's always managing to stay positive with your self-talk, optimistic with your mindset, and take the risks and learn from the failures.
Yes.
And I think one thing I learned, in fact, I went to a whole conference once on self-efficacy, and I found that it's probably really misunderstood. And what I've learned as a coach and in my own business, because I've struggled with this, even though I appear to be very confident, is your self-belief and your inner conviction that you can actually do it. You can deliver what you set out to.
Mm.
And it's a balance as well between being willing to dispute what people say to you, people who tell you you can't do it,
Yes.
people who try to put limits on you. So be willing to dispute and challenge it and tune in to that inner wisdom and take small bets to learn what not to do.
Oh, I love that idea about small bets. And I do think that whole sense of whenever somebody provides a perspective or an opinion, to remind yourself that that's one person's perspective and that's coming from them. Often it can be as much a reflection of their own thinking and their own experience as necessarily a reflection on you. So really what you're talking about there is having a sense of perspective and really strong self-belief about what's possible, and ultimately believing in you and believing in yourself is really key here to be successful and to achieve your potential.
And I've noticed with women, it's like you have to almost be convinced at a gut level, at a visceral level, that
Yeah.
that is your path and that you can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And self-doubt can be a difficult enemy to deal with for many people. Interesting, Janet, when you talk about some of the lessons that have stood out for you, and again, over your journey, whether they've been small or large, I'm sure there's been some particular challenges and setbacks that have stood out for you that, as you say, this is where the learning can really have significant effect. So
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit more about some of those significant setbacks for you personally and professionally on your journey to date as a coach?
I think what's really interesting, especially here in our Australian culture, is not everybody is willing and able to collaborate. So a lot of people will speak of collaboration and together we all,
Yes.
achieve more. But essentially, we are still a very competitive culture. So I think that is really challenging. I've tried probably 4 or 5 times overseas as well as locally to build a team versus going solo. And unless you're willing to, and working with a profit share business model has been a really big setback because that has not been possible. People want skin in the game or they want to be paid, but if you're building a new business, how can you give them skin in the game? And if there's no income, how can you pay them? So
Right.
I think I've lost 3 or 4 or 5 teams. If you can effectively put a group together in a way where it's win-win and truly collaborative, that's very, very powerful way of working. I think the other setback was I have this incredible failure story of spending my last $5,000 in the world at the time of leaving the Middle East and coming to Australia to run a workshop for another consultant, and it wasn't my client, with my new business simulation, and it basically failed. And I had the real visceral in the gut experience of failure where I couldn't show my head for 3 days and had to actually go and get counselling. Yet it was the greatest learning experience possible because I actually was too big a risk to do it. I didn't own the client relationship. The other consultant was not congruent and the other co-facilitator was not prepared. So took me a long time, as you were saying, to understand the reality of the situation rather than just blame myself.
Yeah,
so I learned a lot about risk taking and not beat myself up.
Yeah, and I think, and recognizing that journey you need to go on there as far as the emotional response and just really needing that time to recover, but then also having that commitment to understand and unpack the contributing factors, as you so beautifully outlined there, that contributed to that. And then here am I sitting here listening, rationally going, yeah, that all makes sense. That all adds up. I won't ask you how long it took to work through that, but I think the key thing for me is the importance of that practice of self-reflection, and often it's some of those most difficult experiences that can provide the most powerful learning. And then the key question is then what changed for you as a result of that experience?
Oh yeah, I was able to absolutely pivot the work that I was doing and then take it to the next level. And I think the other thing too is I accept accountability on the other hand, because
Mm.
every entrepreneur is accountable 24/7. So I can be accountable and not beat myself up. So I can see
Yes.
myself as the cause, but not go into self-depreciation. So I also think it was really valuable for me as a coach because, you know, everybody, we all say, oh, the learning zone is outside of the comfort zone. And then
Mm.
you have to ask yourself, when was the last time you were seriously outside of your comfort zone?
Right.
And when they came in with saying, learn fast by failing quickly, I was at conferences where people from the big four banks would say, oh, we can't say that in our culture because, we cannot accept in our culture that people will actually make mistakes and fail. And I think that was detrimental because people never
Mm.
got to have a visceral and hard and cognitive experience of what it means. And I think as coaches, we can't encourage people to learn by failing fast unless we've done it ourselves and been through the horribleness
Yes.
of it and the learning and created the safety to be that way. But that's the future because we don't know. We live in an
Yeah.
unpredictable world. We don't know what's coming.
Absolutely. It's very much about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, and certainly a continuing theme in our conversation today has been around, you use the word visceral a lot, and I think knowing what it feels like literally in your gut in some of those difficult times is an important compass to guide us, isn't it, as far as helping us navigate those experiences that inevitably come up for all of us at some point in time.
Yeah, it goes back to being authentic and congruent and walking your talk.
Mm.
I mean, as facilitators, those of us that have come through the ranks as trainers and facilitators, you know that positive role modeling is really important, and congruence
Mm.
is because it's almost like a state of being. To be brave and bold and do things differently, you need to have
Mm.
we used to call it earn the right. You need to have
Mm.
earned the right to pull people towards that.
Yeah, love that. So, as we move into the closing parts of our conversation today, Janet, and we've been hearing lots of great lessons and reflections already in our discussion. What stands out for you as some of the key reflections that you would share with our listeners, particularly keen to start with defining success, because I know you have an interesting perspective here to share.
Yeah, that is another really interesting question. So, I 35 years ago, I left a very successful corporate career with what was then the Grace Brothers Department Store Group, or the Coles Myer Group. Now
Mm-hmm.
it's Myer Department Store, with the designer wardrobe and, good salary and 4 to 6 trips overseas a year and all of that stuff.
Mm.
So, had it been money and status, I probably would have pursued that career and,
Mm-hmm.
relocated maybe to work overseas. So for me, and it took a long time to understand how important it is to create a clear picture of what success means to you. So as I said, if I'd wanted money and status, I would have pursued
Mm.
a different track. But what really mattered to me was to do something that added value to the quality of people's lives in
Mm.
ways they appreciate and cherish, but also to have a balance in my life between my work and my primary relationship. Now, being a recovering workaholic, that is constantly
Mm.
a challenge. So, success for me is probably a bit different. So I think it's really important is to paint a picture, whether it be a mind map or just a journal entry of in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time, whatever it is for you, what will a successful future look like for you? And I know when I sat down and did it, I was really surprised at what came up. So it is a great reflective exercise to do. I think the second thing, because I'm also a serial meditator, and I am a serial meditator because I grew up pretty much with an anxiety disorder. I think what you need to do, because everybody at the moment is suffering from anxiety or burnout or loneliness or a lack of belonging. So therefore, as coaches, I think we need to find what is often called a flow state. So find your calmness, be grounded, be mindful, be conscious, and sustain it. So we often say, learn to dance in disequilibrium. Be on the one hand really disciplined about what is your purpose, make it meaningful, make sure that it matters, have a really good business model that's going to give you cash flow as well as extra income, know what it is that you stand for or your mission or how it is that you're going to deliver that, have really good habits, as simple as time management. Every client at the moment, it's either prioritization, delegation, time, all of those things. So be really disciplined. And on the other hand, be really creative and improvisational and spontaneous and agile and adaptive. So we call that, how do you balance chaos with order? And that's what flow state means to me. So that's what clients want. So I really think we have to demonstrate that, but also be playful and have some fun. But it is about being really adaptive.
Yes.
And I'm sure in 2 years' time, the environment will be different again. Be strategic, have good systems in place, be really adaptive, be really agile, and always be open to learning. I'm a real bookhead. And I know that when I shifted into this niche, I think I attended every webinar, every free course in the world on innovation at the time. I did MOOCs before I even wrote a MOOC. I did all of those things just to constantly learn. And I think being that open to learning, it's like a funnel until you get to coherence. And I think when you're coherent and congruent in what you're teaching, I think that's really key to being successful. And I think successful means being really effective in being able to help people transform their reality or their lives. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm hearing a real synergy between what you're doing and how you're being and how you're feeling. And again, just thinking about what you mentioned earlier in terms of your flow state. So we're pretty much out of time, Janet. So just by way of wrapping up our session and conversation today, there's a really strong theme emerging for me around, your sense of purpose and a focus, and if you like, alignment with your values and that congruence, who you are and what you're doing and how you're being in the world, and essentially doing good work that brings a strong focus for people and humanity more broadly. So thank you so much for sharing your story today with us and those listening. I certainly learned a lot more about you from where we started, and I'm sure people will get value out of this conversation. So for those people that would like to connect with you, I know you're very active on all social media channels. What's the best way people can get in contact with you?
Well, obviously through LinkedIn. LinkedIn is always the easiest. I'm also on the ICF Global directory. And I do run a Coach for Innovators, Leaders and Teams certified program through the ICF Continuing Coach Education Division.
Lovely.
And I'm very generous with my time. So if you've got any questions, you can email me, Janet@Imagination. So you can see there,
Yeah, just duck now so we can get the full spelling.
.com.au.
Beautiful.
Or connect with me on the various pages on Facebook.
Thanks so much, Jen. I really, again, appreciate your time today. And thank you too for everyone that has taken the time to hear us through to this conversation. I hope that you got the same amount of value that I did and enjoyment from hearing from Janet. Bye for now.
And thank you, Rebecca, for making that so seamless and so easy. And I wish everybody great success for the future.
You're very welcome, Janet.